Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Mark Andrew Holacek, Thomas Jefferson scholar, philosopher, historian. And today I want to talk to you about a particular book. It's Alan Taylor, he's the Thomas Jefferson Foundation uh, Thomas Jefferson Foundation professor at University of Virginia, and the book is titled, as you can see, Thomas Jefferson's Education. Now, I very much enjoy doing book reviews. And I've published, I don't know how many in my life. I like them very much simply because one trained in analytic philosophy, a book review gives one's analytic skills good exercise. Um, Now, when one writes a book, one of the first questions is, why do we need this book? Um, that's the first question that needs to be offered. When I look at a book, I look at the title, I look at the contents, I look at the preface, and I want to be able to understand what the thesis is. I ought to be able to, by reading the table of contents here, and it's very difficult to see, but he's got college, revolution, honor, mountain slavery, schools, buildings, professors, students, ends. You're certainly not going to figure out what the thread is, the thesis, by looking at the contents. And, part of the problem is when you look at the preface as well, you don't get an idea. Now, the title, Thomas Jefferson's Education, um, just thinking about the title, one fully expects that you're going to get a historical survey of Thomas Jefferson's own personal education from as a boy all the way through his years of University of Virginia, and then perhaps, come on up, Jeff, come on, and then perhaps there'll be something. He's always got to be in the picture. There'll be perhaps something to say about, as I say in my book. I have a book on Thomas Jefferson's philosophy of education, about Jefferson's education as a lifelong learner. Jefferson uh, really loved to learn all of his life. So on one hand, I think Taylor. He's won two Pulitzers for other works, and his writing is very readable. And he's a talented writer. It's an enjoyable. His prose is enjoyable. There's one particular problem. There's no thesis. This certainly is not about Thomas Jefferson's education. It's really about Thomas Jefferson's views, work at Thomas Jefferson's at University of Virginia. You'd certainly not know that from the title. Now, he says there's no reference to my book on, Thomas Jefferson's philosophy of education, Utopian Dream, and I find that rather puzzling that someone could write a book on Thomas Jefferson's education and miss what I consider to be one of the most important books on Thomas Jefferson and education. He writes somewhere in the book, this book examines Jefferson's efforts to reform Virginia through education. Okay, it's an analysis of the social relations of education. Uh, okay, now the first five chapters of the number of chapters here and how many were there, the first five chapters are prefatory. He gives a blob. There are 10 chapters. And the first five, colleges, revolution, honor, mountain, slavery, always got to be something on slavery in there, uh, give the sort of background information to get into what's going on at the University of Virginia. That a book that comprises 10 chapters should have, should half the book should be prefatory it's farcical. It's ridiculous. Why not title it? If you're going to do that, you can do that. But if you're going to do that, give it a title, something like The State of Education in Jeffersonian Virginia and Jefferson's Attempts to Reform It. Well, we don't get that. Now, throughout, like I said, it's an enjoyable read, chiefly because there are numerous divagations, numerous veerings off the straight and narrow path. I want to say it's a veering off the straight and narrow path, but I don't know what the thesis is, so it's hard to tell what a divagation amounts to here. Um, in chapter 4, for example, he goes off on a tangent, starts talking about Francis Walker Gilmer, who entered into the circle of intellectuals at Monticello, took more than a liking for Thomas Jefferson's granddaughter, favorite granddaughter, Ellen Wales Randolph, but was, according to Taylor, he was snubbed because of his family's lack of money. Well, that's really kind of a cool story, but what does this have to do with the University of Virginia? And that's just one of numerous, strayings from the story that he's supposed to be telling here about the University of Virginia, which is not given in the title. The epilogue, for example, he gives an epilogue, and one might expect some concluding thoughts on what he thinks about Jefferson's University of Virginia. No, he goes on to talk about the decrepit state of affairs of Jefferson's family once Jefferson dies. So, what does that have to do with education with the University of Virginia? Nothing. Another problem is Taylor is completely out of a fish out of water when it comes to Thomas Jefferson. I spoke to him by email on a couple occasions. We were supposed to get together over 2 years ago. He never responded to my last two emails. Um, Lack of familiarity with with Thomas Jefferson. I asked him if he plans on writing any more books on Thomas Jefferson. He said, no, not really. So here you have you had Dumas Malone, who wrote 6 volumes on Thomas Jefferson over 4 decades, and Merrill Peterson, who followed as the Thomas Jefferson Foundation scholar and wrote so many wonderful books on Thomas Jefferson. And then we had Peter Onuf, who wrote, well, he sort of started, things started nosediving. Things took an Onufian turn. And Taylor is the one who follows Peter Onuf and doesn't particularly. I remember when I emailed Onuf when the job was open, thinking that maybe I had a snowball's chance in hell of getting it, so I might as well try to apply. And Onuf told me if they wanted someone who knew something about Jefferson, they don't want that, basically. Okay, he talks about uh, Jefferson's views at University of Virginia, but he doesn't talk about his 2 bills. His bill for the more general diffusion of knowledge, and later that was in 1779, and another bill that he does some almost 40 years later in 1819. There's no sustained discussion over these 2 things. He writes also that Jefferson promoted a top-down educational program for Virginia's improvement. That's just plainly a false statement. The fact that University of Virginia is sort of the capstone of Virginia's system. But Jefferson said on one occasion, a quote I have in my book, that if I had a choice between the university and the in the lowest level schools, he would definitely go with the lower level schools because they're not, Jefferson wanted to instantiate these lower level ward schools, 1 school in each ward, and maybe 100 wards in a county or whatever. And the point is there weren't ward schools at the time, and Jefferson's political philosophy demanded that each person receive an education according to his own needs. And the average person, a farmer, would need reading and writing and basic arithmetic to carry on his deeds. So there needed to be these ward schools. And Jefferson says plainly on one occasion, if I could choose between the university and the lower level schools, the ward schools, I would choose to have the ward schools. The ward schools, the bills were never passed to instantiate the ward schools. And the reason for that is that there'll always be higher level education for the rich people. They'll always have access to higher level education. So it's more important to create reforms at the bottom, you know. So this whole notion that he promoted a top-down educational program is just clearly false, right? Um, there are many misstatements. Taylor says that Jefferson had a vision for free and autonomous persons, and I quote him here, each with the same rights except for enslaved people. Clearly, Taylor is unfamiliar with Jefferson's first draft of his Declaration of Independence, where he talks about black people as MEN, and he capitalizes the letters. And he's insistent that black people have the same rights as all other people, whatever their situation might be. And Jefferson says that a lot. Did not champion rationality as much as people think. So very few people had rationality. So it's more important for people to have equal rights, regardless of the level of their rationality. So there's very few Galileos and Newtons and Boyles and things like that. He, of course, buys into the Sally Hemings story, following Peter Onuf and Annette Gordon Reed and the other people. Uh, Taylor mentions Jefferson was fond of expensive books. He was fond of them, but he didn't buy them. Jefferson, on one occasion, says, seldom bought them. He said, I always look for a cheaper version of a particular book, so he can more interested in having the best quality books in terms of translations or authors and things like that. He wasn't instead of buying the most expensive books, he wanted the best bargains for books. So he seldom bought. Being fond of expensive books doesn't mean you go out and buy them. He writes that Jefferson was deeply conflicted about the large number of persons, most uninvited, that would throng to Monticello. No, he wasn't deeply conflicted. There were people thronging. His daughter mentions at one time 50 uninvited guests staying at Monticello after his presidency. People would come to visit the sage, and and they would eat him out of house and home and drink his wine and so forth. Jefferson wasn't deeply conflicted. Those are Taylor's words. He hated that. That is the main reason why he had Poplar Forest built, so he'd have a getaway retreat. Now, when Taylor references, he gives a footnote for the deeply conflicted, and he writes in a footnote, he says, deeply conflicted derives from the immortal words of historian Peter Onuf, who was also immortal. Little bootlicking there, Alan, is it not? One could ask, is there a little cronyism here? Did he get the job because of Peter Onuf? I'm throwing stuff out. I really don't know. But, that's not a scholarly footnote to say that Peter Onuf was also immortal. Anyways, finally, Taylor writes, keeping students at the university through the summer reinforced his insistence that Charlottesville was the healthiest and happiest place on earth. All right, that's a cute sentiment. Where the hell does Jefferson ever say that? Right, now he cites two letters in support of that claim. If you look at his citation, you go to the citations, Jefferson says nothing that's even comparable. It's nothing even close to what he says. So again, really sloppy scholarship. All right, now there's also the problem, obviously, instead of just making false statements, there's also the problem with failure to quantify. What do I mean to quantify a statement? Statement needs to be quantified when it needs to be all or none or some or something like that. I offer some examples and I'll explain. Taylor writes, when challenged for failing to end slavery, Virginians replied that they had achieved something even greater by separating church and state. So when he talks about Virginians reply, is it all Virginians, some Virginians, most Virginians? Another example, enslaved people mocked and envied the laziness of their master, likening him to the hog who does not do anything except eat, drink, and stroll around. He lies down when the fancy takes him, and he lies like a gentleman. Again, all enslaved people thought this. That seems to be the implication here, but clearly, if so, it's a false statement. Another instance, Virginians fussed over external appearances to display status and read that of others. All Virginians, most Virginians, some Virginians. Again, Virginians associated a fire bells alarm with the slave revolt. All Virginians, some Virginians, most Virginians. Now, this occurs, I've only given you 4 instances. This occurs all throughout the book, where someone throws in statements without the proper quantifier. The implication seems to be that the appropriate quantifier in each instance would be all, but plugging in all for every one of those statements, one just gets a false claim. So, as an analytic philosopher, you could say, well, I'm being too nitpicky, but no, I'm not. I want clarity here. I want to know what you're talking. I want to know what you're saying. All right, there are many paralogisms, many really bad arguments. I give one. He says, and I quote him here, he says, a visitor to Albemarle County reported that the enslaved could seldom get anything to eat then, a bread made of corn. They're very poorly clad, almost half naked. Albemarle was the land of opportunity for free folk because they exploited the labor of slaves just as their parents and grandparents did in the Tidewater. Right? So we have one visitor talking about the dreadful condition of slaves in Albemarle. One report, not two, not three, not 10, not 20, one. This is called single shot inductivism. It makes for a poor argument. It's like saying, okay, I have my dog Jefferson on my lap. He's predominantly of black fur. I note that, and I conclude from that all dogs are predominantly of black fur. You see what kind of silly argument that is. Okay. In keeping with Peter Onuf, Gordon Reed, and other revisionists of that ilk that are probably close to uh, Alan Taylor, we have frequent use of emotive prose. Um, I'll give you some examples and I'll say something about emotivism in writing history. Taylor writes, leading patriots recognized a gap between their soaring ideals and the sordid practice of slavery. So we have sordid ideals, soaring ideals, the sordid practice. Okay, so we've got the sort of metaphors here. Leading patriots recognized the gap between their ideals and the practice of slavery. And slavery, as if to say slavery is a really bad thing. Well, we know that. Another example, Jefferson longed to whiten Virginia by emancipating enslaved people and sending them to a distant colony in Africa or the Caribbean. Why do we need to whiten? Obviously, he's making a point about the white racism of Thomas Jefferson. In a third instance, Jefferson preferred to wait. He's talking about the year 1805. Jefferson preferred to wait for some dramatic shift in public opinion before intervening against slavery. But how that shift would happen without leadership, he could not say. In other words, Jefferson is expecting a miracle. Talking about it's a knock at Jefferson's lack of rationality here. He's expecting something to happen with slavery, but it's not going to happen. Taylor goes on to talk about that the story he's telling about University of Virginia is not a heroic story. It's more, he says, and I quote, more tragic than heroic. Well, that can only be because he focuses on the negatives. I have written my own book on Thomas Jefferson's philosophy of education, and there were numerous triumphs. The very establishment of the institution today is one, with a great medical school. It's one of the great schools in the country, and that's due to Thomas Jefferson. And to say that the story is more tragic than heroic, this is just more revisionist bullshit. He talks about the miscreant students, the drunkenness, the rioting, the brutality, the disobedience. That's been talked about, and that existed, and it's important to talk about that there. But he didn't talk about any of the victories, and there certainly were many victories at University of Virginia. The very fact that it exists today. Now, I want to end by just saying again, when I look at a book, I want to know what the thesis is. I don't get a thesis in Taylor's book. I get a bunch of rambling stories, a bunch of emotive language. I get the divagations, asides, and so forth, bad arguments, and an account of Thomas Jefferson in keeping with Peter Onuf that Jefferson was just not a very nice guy. So again, one asks, what's the motivation for a book? If I'm going to write a book, there has to be a reason for writing it. And to sell the book to a potential publisher, one needs to articulate that to that publisher. I wrote a book that's getting published with Peter Lang on Thomas Jefferson Guardian of the Natural Bridge. Motivation for that book is that there's never been a book on Thomas Jefferson on the natural bridge. Jefferson owned the bridge from 1774 till his final days. In another such book, even if you write a book that, I'm currently working on one called Jefferson and the Disease of Liberty. That's a provisional title. Many people have written books on Jefferson's views of liberty or have books in which they talk abundantly on Jefferson's views of liberty. But I want to capture in that book something about Jefferson's conception of liberty that other people haven't captured. I think Jefferson really was infatuated to a great extent with that concept of liberty, much more than other people who were liberals of his time. So I want to capture that infatuation in the book. That's what I'm doing differently there, and so forth. So when you write a book, the idea is to have something unique to say. If you're going to talk about things that have about which have been talked before, you need to have a different take, or you need to clear up some of the confusion that exists in earlier books. I don't see, to be quite frank, I don't see that this book contributes anything to our understanding of Thomas Jefferson. There have been other books on Jefferson and UVA that have been better written. It's an enjoyable account, like I said. You're going to go off, Taylor will take you off on many digressions, and they're fun digressions. Digressions aren't always a terrible thing, just from the point of view being entertained. But the idea is that those digressions tell us nothing about Jefferson's University of Virginia. And as I said before, it's astonishing that someone could have 10 chapters in a book, 5 of which are prefatory. So, anyways, Alan Taylor said he's not going to write another book on Jefferson, and maybe that's a good thing. Anyways, we'll do this again some other time. We'll have another book review within a week or so, and ta-ta for now.